My name is David Holloway, and it's my pleasure to introduce this afternoon's panel, which will be devoted to a presentation and discussion of the book Insider Threats, which has been co-edited by two of our panelists, Matt Bunn and Scott Sagan, and Amy Ziegart has contributed a chapter to the book. I should say the editors have also contributed chapters to the book. Let me introduce them briefly in alphabetical order. Matthew Bunn is a professor of practice at the Kennedy School. He's the co-PI of the Belfer Center's project on managing the atom. And the focus of his work over the years has been on securing nuclear materials and conducting studies that have had a significant influence in defining US policy on the treatment of, in relation to nuclear security and on the disposition of fissile material. Scott Sagan needs no introduction to this audience. He's the former co-director of CSAC, the Carolyn S.G. Monroe Professor of Political Science, and a senior fellow here at CSAC and FSI. And his work has ranged widely on nuclear issues, with a particular focus on organizational theory to explore issues to do with the safety and security of nuclear weapons and nuclear materials. He heads the global, you still head the Global Nuclear Initiative at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, Scott. You're still one of your many.
I'm heading their ethics and war project.
Right. But, and Amy Ziegart is the third panelist, and she is the co-director of CSAC, a senior fellow here and at FSI, and the Davis Family Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution. She's published 3 books on American national security agencies and is now leading the program on cybersecurity here at CSAC. So it would be hard to find a better and more qualified panel to discuss these issues. That's why, of course, they've written the book. So let me turn it over to Scott. I think you're the first speaker.
I'll be speaking first. That's great. Well, thank you very much, David, and thank you all for coming. Matt and I have been on the road talking about this book for a while now, speaking at the Department of Energy, the Los Alamos National Lab, the Sandia National Lab, the Livermore Lab, Laboratory yesterday, think tanks in Washington, Harvard University, and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. But it gives me particular pleasure to come here and speak because this book was actually hatched, not just at CSAC, but in this room. Yeah. Indeed, Matt and I had been discussing questions about insider threats for many years, since he and I had had an exchange in the engineering journal Risk Analysis about an article I wrote called The Problem of Redundancy Problem, how adding more security forces may decrease nuclear security. And what he and I recognized from this more theoretical exchange was that we actually lacked good empirical work on insider threats. And as we do here at CSAC, we are able to bring a whole group of people in for a meeting where people present their ideas, and we had engineers, nuclear operators, U.S. military, Department of Energy people, State Department people, scholars, some of whom, like Thomas Heghammer and Amy Ziegart and Jessica Stern, had long histories with CSAC. Others were just specialists that we brought in because we really liked the work that they were doing, and then we commented on each other's work. Had a second meeting at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and decided to take the best papers and try to put them together with Matt, and Matt and I trying to do a summary. We produced a summary that was also published by the American Academy. There are many best practices guides about nuclear security. But what we noted was they all talked about really good things that had happened and very rarely shared the real experiences of all the dumb things that had actually happened that produced the need for all these best practices guide. So with our tongues firmly in cheek, we produced a worst practices guide. Bismarck once said that only fools learn from their mistakes. Wise men learn from the mistakes of others. And we thought it would behoove us to share stories about things that have gone wrong and try to supply lessons. There are many organizations, say diamond mines or casinos, that expect that there'll be lots of insider threat problems, theft. There are others that are high security organizations with enormous risk and morale and have a strong sense of loyalty. And we would like to think, and they would like to think, that they don't have insider threat problems. But as we surveyed the field, we recognized that insiders are very common. Every U.S. military service, Air Force with Chris Cook, who sold secret launch code information to the Soviet Union during the Cold War, the Navy with John Walker conspiracy theory, again selling material to the Soviets, the Army with Chelsea Manning. Every one of the intelligence agencies has suffered a major insider threat problem, with Robert Hanssen from the FBI, Aldrich Ames from CIA, Edward Snowden we all know from the NSA. And every laboratory that we've been to has had a different insider threat problem. And even in our talk at Livermore, we were just amazed how few people at Livermore knew about their own history of insider threats. And we talked about some of the problems that they've had of people caught in relationships with Chinese spies or someone selling information to the Israelis. And that organizational history got lost. Organizations very rarely like to air their dirty linen in public. What we've discovered is that they very rarely like to air their dirty linen in private, even among themselves. And that restricts not only how much they learn from the past in themselves, but certainly how much they can learn vicariously from each other. So producing a sense of what are the organizational dysfunctions, what common problems, how common is it for people to see red flags? Whenever we look at incidents, we see, oh boy, how could they not have seen that coming? Red flags are really common when you look at this, and they're ignored at the time. Why is that? So we came up with a set of lessons. I'm going to walk through the beginning of them, turn it over to Amy, who's going to do a deep dive in one of the really superb case studies that she produced for our volume about the Fort Hood shooting incident. Turn it back to me, and I'll pass on to Matt, who will walk through the rest of the lessons. So very briefly, lesson one, and the takeaway I want you to take away is this picture of Indira Gandhi smiling in front of her assassin, Bent Singh. There were death threats against Mrs. Gandhi and her family during the 1984 crackdown on the Sikh uprising, and the individuals involved in the leadership of the security, their equivalent of the Secret Service, wanted to have extra security personnel and wondered whether it was appropriate to think about restricting Sikhs. Mrs. Gandhi said, absolutely not. We're a democracy. We're multicultural, multi-religious democracy. Moreover, my favorite security guard is Bent Singh. He's the one I talk to all the time. He's loyal. They arranged to have more guards, including one of whom was his cousin. They conspired to be put together on a detail, and when they were alone with Mrs. Gandhi, they shot her. It's very common in organizations to think there are problems of insiders in other organizations, but not in our organization. So just as there's a NIMBY phenomenon, not in my backyard, we label this the not in my organization. And to the degree that we can just get people to accept that there are serious problems in all organizations, and that their organization is not an exception, we will have done, I think, an important service. That's especially problematic when you have loyal people who can be converted or can be radicalized or can change. Much of the evidence we see in different case studies that we review in our book show how quickly people turn from being a loyal member of an organization to being an opponent of it. Here are 3 examples. And that leads us to conclude that, contrary to what many leaders of organizations, who when you speak to them say, we don't have a problem because we've got really good background checks. Background checks are not sufficient. They may help sometimes, but there are cases that we know about of people who have learned how to get around background checks, who have learned how to give the right answers or to give misleading answers under lie detection tests. There are loyal employees who are loyal to their organization, like a bank case that we studied, the Northern Bank, but they were coerced because they're also loyal to their family. And this leads us to say that when you have radicalization, you have loyalty, you have all these problems, background checks provide a snapshot. They don't provide a sense of the person's character. And it's too often that a leader says, I understand my workers, I understand the people, because I understand their character. Background checks can provide a sense of a snapshot. Let me turn now to Amy, who will dive deep in one of the most important case studies in our book, that of Nidal Hasan.
Thanks, Scott. Let me just say very briefly, these guys are the masters of the incremental commitment strategy. So it was an incredibly enjoyable process to work with Matt and Scott. The whole thing started by saying, you can just walk down the hall, just come to this workshop. It morphed into, can you present something maybe you're already working on? And now here we are with this book that they've put together. Let me just also say it takes a community. So parts of this chapter were presented at CSAC. Joe Felter was our discussant. Martha Crenshaw gave me lots of comments. So thanks to all of you for making this project better than it started by a long shot. I want to talk about the Fort Hood shooting of 2009. So November 5th, 2009, an Army major named Nidal Hasan walked into the base at Fort Hood in Texas and opened fire. He fired 200 rounds, he killed 13 people, and he wounded 43. At that time, this was the most serious terrorist attack on American soil since 9/11. Now, Nidal Hasan was not a foreign jihadi who came to the United States. He was a self-radicalized Army officer who was born and raised in Virginia. He was called Michael by his friends in high school, and he spent his entire professional career as an Army psychiatrist. So the question is, what went wrong in this case? Now, initially after the attack, the postmortems, and there were several investigations that started off classified and became more declassified over time. But initially, the postmortems really attributed the attack to leadership failures within the Pentagon, to poor policy guidance, and to political correctness that possibly prevented officials in the Army from disciplining or taking greater action against a Muslim soldier. But what I find is that there are organizational weaknesses lurking behind the scenes, both in the Army and in the FBI, that played an essential and overlooked role. Organizational factors, as Scott knows very well and has written so eloquently about, are like the dark matter of the policy universe. They're affecting everything that happens in ways that we often don't realize. So what I find is that Hasan slipped through the cracks, not so much because individuals made mistakes or feared fallout of political correctness, but because the Army and the FBI operated as they usually did. Structures and processes and cultures designed in earlier periods for rational reasons proved maladaptive to detect this insider threat. Now, let me give you a sense. The criticism always when you have these retrospective assessments is, organizations can't be 100% successful. But in this case, it's clear that failure was by no means inevitable. And let me just share with you 3 reasons why that is. The first is that, unlike some of the other cases in the book, Hasan's radicalization was not rapid. It took place over 6 years. His transformation from Army officer to fratricidal terrorist was not sudden, and it was not secret. He was openly radical, and he was flagrantly incompetent at his job, just to give you some idea. He justified suicide bombers. He declared his devotion to Sharia law superseded his responsibility to the U.S. Constitution, and he did so to his peers and his supervisors repeatedly over a period of years in conversations, in classroom presentations, in PowerPoint slides, all while barely performing his job. He was rated in the bottom 25% of his cohort. One presentation he gave so alarmed his medical residency classmates, they erupted in protest, and the instructor had to stop it after just a couple of minutes. Several people reported Hassan to his superiors. This was not a red flag operating in secret. They reported him to his superiors, and two called him a ticking time bomb, which was the title of the Senate Homeland Security Committee report. So this was no secret, radicalization. Now the second picture, many of you recognize this man. He's Anwar al-Awlaki. Hassan appeared on the FBI's radar screen almost a year before he opened fire at Fort Hood because he was discovered emailing Anwar al-Awlaki in Yemen. Al-Awlaki, as many of you know, was a radical American cleric, very senior in Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, and was later killed in a drone strike in Yemen in 2011. He was also known at that time to be one of the world's most dangerous virtual spiritual sanctioners, one of the most inspiring terrorist leaders in the world. So Hassan's first email, the email that trips the wire at the FBI a year before this attack, asks whether a Muslim U.S. soldier who commits fratricide would be considered a martyr in the eyes of Islam. This is the first email that trips the wire. It is the reddest of red flags. And it is the first of 18 communications between these two men over the next 12 months. Finally, this is 8 years after 9/11. So just to put this time period in context, awareness about the terrorist threat was high at the time, and several reforms, both in intelligence and counterterrorism agencies, have been in place for a period of several years. Failure was not inevitable. So what went wrong and why? So there are two organizations that I look at, the Army and the FBI. And as I'll go through quickly, each suffered from silent organizational deficiencies that made it difficult, if not impossible, to bring these red flags together so that they could be, so that they could sound the alarm and indicate that a trusted insider was becoming, in fact, an insider threat. Let me start with the Army. I'm going to run through the failures on the left, and then I'll talk about their organizational roots on the right. The Army had essentially three different systems that could have identified Hassan as a growing threat and taken action to prevent that threat. And all three of these systems failed in this case. The first system is the disciplinary system. Hassan, as I mentioned, was never disciplined. He was never dismissed from the military, despite signs of alarming radicalization and terrible job performance. Just to give you a little tidbit about just how bad his performance was, he was an Army psychiatrist who routinely didn't show up for work or answer his phone when he was on call. So despite both radicalization and poor performance, no disciplinary action was ever taken against him. The second system in the Pentagon was the performance evaluation system used to decide who's going to be promoted. Hassan gets promoted repeatedly throughout his career. He receives positive reviews that the Senate found bore no resemblance to the real Hassan. The officer evaluation reports, which are the forms that are used for promotion, had only one negative grade about Hassan because he failed to take a fitness test during one of his reviews. The third and final system was the counterterrorism investigatory system, which was run by the FBI, but jointly with agency participation from across the U.S. government in organizations called Joint Terrorism Task Forces. So there was a Defense Department official on the Joint Terrorism Task Force that was investigating Hassan. Now, this investigation proved to be slim, to put it mildly. The Defense Department investigator on the FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Force never interviewed Hassan, never interviewed a colleague, never interviewed a superior. He spent a grand total of 4 hours on his counterterrorism investigation, looking at databases, and he found some of the emails between Hassan and Anwar al-Awlaki, and he concluded that they must be legitimate for Hassan's research. All three of these failures, if we look more deeply, have organizational root causes. Right? Why was Hassan not disciplined or dismissed from his job? Lots of disincentives to do that in the Army. At this particular point in time, there were extreme shortages, both in terms of rank and in terms of specialty for psychiatrists in the Army. So there were shortages for captains and majors. Hassan was a captain, then promoted to major. There were shortages in the medical corps. There was a GAO report found that they only had 83% of the medical corps officers that they needed at the time. And shortages were particularly acute for mental health professionals in the Army. Again, think about the time frame. We're engaged in 2 wars with mental health issues skyrocketing within the military. Keeping medical health professionals within the Army was a priority. So there were enormous disincentives to disciplining or dismissing anyone of Hassan's rank or specialty. One military official who I interviewed for this project told me, during that period, everyone was getting promoted. It was impossible not to get promoted. If you suggested it, he said to me, people would think you were stupid. In addition to this, there were opportunity costs. We all know this in the management world and in the management literature. As one official put it to me, 50% of every manager's time is spent managing the 3% who shouldn't be there. And so what the Army did was find a workaround to deal with Hassan, and that workaround is called transferring him to another base. So he left Walter Reed and was transferred to Fort Hood because he was a problem. The officer who assigned Hassan to Fort Hood told his colleague there, and I quote, "You're getting our worst." Add on to this certainly the incentives that you don't in particular want to take disciplinary action against a Muslim given the political considerations at hand, you can see why there were strong disincentives to take action against Hassan. The second problem, the performance evaluation system. Why was Hassan promoted when we had these red flags that were gathering that were reported to his colleagues and his superiors? Well, what I found is that it's important to understand how these forms are actually used, these officer evaluation reports. They're designed for promotion. They're not designed to catch insider threats. They have extreme standardization on these forms, and I got my hands on a copy of one of these forms, and what you see is they have yes, no boxes for different criteria. So does the candidate exhibit leadership? Yes or no? So the other example I give of this is Stephen Colbert had this very funny segment where he asked mostly Democratic officials whether George W. Bush was a great president or the greatest president, to see what they said. So when you truncate the grading range, you can get some pretty weird responses. And in this case, in the in the Army's evaluation system, there was literally no room on the form for derogatory information or potential red flags unless you actually wanted to deny that person promotion. So that's why it wasn't in there. So these forms were a poor reflection of reality, but Hassan was not the exception, right? Hassan was the rule. They were always a poor reflection of reality because of the nature of the form. Now, just want to add briefly, there's a second evaluation system within the Army at the time that did collect red flags. This is the local personal evaluation system that each commander had for the men and women in his or her unit. But these files were local and they were temporary. So as soon as someone moved from one command to another, the files were thrown away. So if I were Hassan's commander, I would have no visibility into any of the red flags that anyone had raised at his prior postings. So you have these formal official forms that don't capture red flags and these temporary personal local forms that do capture them but are not aggregating. They're not putting the red flags together. But the question here is, so the FBI investigation I noted concluded that Hassan's emails must be legitimate. Well, why would they make that conclusion? Why would this defense official actually come to that conclusion? Well, it turns out he was the wrong person for the job, right? What do I mean by that? Well, it turns out that the investigator in the Joint Terrorism Task Force had no counterterrorism experience, no counterintelligence experience. He came from a unit in the Pentagon called the Defense Criminal Investigative Service, or DCIS, which is charged with investigating waste, fraud, and abuse. I looked, and in a 2-year period, there were only 2 cases a year where the Defense Criminal Investigative Service dealt with anything remotely connected to counterterrorism or counterintelligence. Perspective is everything. So this investigator came to the Hassan investigation and looked at it through a law enforcement lens. He asked whether Hassan had already committed a crime or whether he was in the process of committing a crime at that moment. And the answer was he wasn't. He didn't ask whether Hassan might be a future threat or could be an intelligence danger, a gathering intelligence danger. The investigator also thought that because Hassan used his actual name in his email communications with Anwar al-Awlaki, it must be legitimate. Because in his research experience, criminals tried to cover up what they were doing and cover up their association and their names. And the fact that Hassan was emailing this radical terrorist with his real name led him to believe that it must be okay, that nothing nefarious was afoot. So why was this guy investigating Hassan in the first place? Well, because he was from a unit in the Pentagon that was the most expendable, the least mission critical at a moment when we were fighting 2 wars at the same time. So the FBI asks for people to be detailed to Joint Terrorism Task Forces. The Pentagon says, who can we spare? The Defense Criminal Investigative Service. We can spare someone from there. The FBI finds this investigator attractive because, like an FBI special agent, he has law enforcement capabilities and authorities. And so it flies in the face of the whole idea of a Joint Terrorism Task Force, which is to bring different perspectives to bear to understand a counterterrorism investigation. Instead, the FBI got more people that treated this investigation like the FBI did, which was a law enforcement investigation. Okay, so let me now move more explicitly into the FBI. Now, the FBI's handling of this investigation within the Joint Terrorism Task Force system was riddled with coordination snafus. There were 2 Joint Terrorism Task Forces involved in this investigation. One in San Diego, which first got the intercept of these emails between Hassan and Anwar al-Awlaki, and one in Washington, D.C., which had the lead because that's the closest office to where Hassan was working at the time. So the office that is most concerned about the threat is not the office that's charged with investigating the threat. Each Joint Terrorism Task Force then thought the other was doing its due diligence of Hassan's communications with Anwar al-Awlaki, when in fact neither Joint Terrorism Task Force was, an example of social shirking in the organization theory literature. It turns out that after the investigation concluded, there were 16 more messages between these 2 men before the terrorist attack, sitting in the FBI's data warehouse system database. Nobody knew they were there because each field office thought the other was tracking them. In these communications, Hassan offers Anwar al-Awlaki whatever help he might need, including to call him collect, should he be of service. One supervisory special agent in charge of the case in Washington told the FBI's own Fort Hood review he would have opened a preliminary investigation of Hassan had he seen the additional emails. In addition to that, there was supposed to be a coordinating mechanism at the FBI headquarters level in 2 ways, something called a National Joint Terrorism Task Force, or the NJTTF, the FBI likes its acronyms, and the Counterterrorism Division. Neither one of these organizations provided any coordination role at all. In fact, the National Joint Terrorism Task Force didn't even know about this investigation until after the shooting. So that's the first problem. The second problem is that the FBI, as I said a moment ago, treated Hassan like a law enforcement case, not an intelligence thread to be pulled. These 2 problems, again, have organizational root causes. The FBI had coordination snafus because the FBI has, for its entire history, been a highly decentralized organization with 56 different field offices across the United States that operate largely autonomously. Now, this made sense when the FBI was created to have local level priorities driving FBI investigations. It makes much less sense when you're talking about coordination across different geographic ranges to detect and deal with insider threats. So the joke in the FBI is that the FBI is 56 field offices with a headquarters attached, right? That's how weak the central coordinating mechanisms of the Bureau are. So, and in addition, of course, we have this social shirking phenomenon, which has been found in many other contexts. So that's the coordination problems shouldn't be surprising given the FBI's history of field office supremacy, left hand not knowing what the right hand is doing. The second problem, why would the FBI treat Hassan like a law enforcement case as opposed to an intelligence investigation? And the reason here has to do with deep-seated structures, incentives, and cultures in the Bureau, which has primarily been a law enforcement organization for more than 100 years. The Bureau always has been law enforcement first, and that means focusing on chasing individual cases and winning convictions. After 9/11, of course, the goal was to get the FBI to be more intelligence-driven. This was a priority of Director Mueller, who came into office 1 week before 9/11. And to be intelligence-driven, the reforms wanted to get the FBI to collect and analyze intelligence as an end in itself, not just in connection to close a case. But the persistence of that case orientation and agent primacy as opposed to analysis led both task forces to pick up the right intelligence signals but draw the wrong conclusions. So instead of searching for intelligence about a connection or implications for the radicalization of Nidal Hasan, they looked very narrowly at the case and whether Hasan was at that exact moment of the investigation engaged in criminal activity. The FBI was not collecting intelligence, it was hunting a criminal, and that's why they didn't find the insider threat in their midst. Now I know you all are going to talk about the worst practices guide, so I don't want to give that away, but I do want to highlight just a couple of, I think, implications from this particular case. The first is, if we look at bullet point number 3, even seemingly obvious red flags are sometimes ignored for perfectly rational reasons. There are cost-benefit calculations that have to do with careers and structures and incentives that make it highly unlikely that organizations like the Army or the FBI can actually identify, collect, and aggregate red flags, right? This wasn't a mistake. This is the natural outgrowth of some of these underlying organizational factors. And finally, if you look at what the recommended policy fixes were after the Fort Hood attack, the Pentagon exhorted leaders to be better leaders. They wanted to promulgate more rules. They disciplined 9 superiors in Hassan's chain of command. But when all 9 superiors in a chain of command make the same bad call, it's an indication that there are more systemic problems at play. And so these organizational challenges, I find, need more organizational solutions. Let me turn it back to Scott.
Great. I'll just give one more example that comes from Jessica Stern and Ron Schouten's marvelous chapter in the book about the Anthrax killer, Bruce Ivins, a senior scientist at the U.S. Defense Weapons Laboratory. There are similar and some differences, but some really great similarities in the organizational story that Amy's telling, and some also interesting psychological variables that are played up in Ron and Jessica's chapter. Bruce Ivins is someone who is working on anthrax. He expresses concerns about his own mental health to colleagues. He has conversations with his therapists that leads one of them to say he is dangerous. One of them is so concerned that a junior therapist goes to her boss and says, should I warn potential people? And he says, write it up. I want to see the full report. He ends up getting a long report and decides not to read it because it was too long. There's so much in it that his policy was you wait for a short report. Those are the ones you have to read. So you should not just assume that red flags won't be read properly. Sometimes they're not even read. R-E-A-D. There were cases, he had numerous cases of unrequited love from college through his co-workers, and became obsessed with a number of these women, would brag about how important anthrax was and how important it was going to be in the future. He stalked a number of them. One of them did report his behavior and said she was afraid of him to a boss, was afraid that Bruce Ivins might go postal. And she was told, why don't you work in a different part of the lab for a while, because he's going to retire soon anyway. And one of the psychological factors involved here was that Bruce Ivins was a likable guy part of the time. An affect bias, the psychological effect where if you like one part of somebody, and your basic premise is that this is a good man, you can overlook so much. And repeatedly we heard the phrase, and they repeat it among investigators, that some of the actions that he was doing was just Bruce being Bruce. He's eccentric. He's a churchgoer. We like most of his activities, and the idea that this man would decide to spread anthrax, not to create massive killing, just to create enough to create an interest in his own work and to show how important his own work, perhaps to impress the women that he was trying to impress, partly to keep his job for himself, to show how important his own work was something that people couldn't imagine. It was only afterwards, after he had tried to cover up his tracks and the FBI was coming down on him, that he killed himself. And most of the evidence, I think, firmly points out all these red flags that were ignored at the time. Matt, let me turn it over to you to go quickly through the last lessons.
So, in a way, there is an interesting difference in the Bruce Ivins and the Nidal Hasan cases in that I would argue there weren't as many rational reasons for overlooking the red flags but there are always these disincentives. People don't want to get their friends and colleagues in trouble. It's a big pain in the rear end for the reporter because sometimes it's not anonymous reporting and the person knows who reported on them. I spoke to a person at Y12 who was working in the highly enriched uranium processing area and was working with a colleague who had a particular very specialized skill in uranium processing, and the guy was starting to act strange, and he reported on him so that person was then taken out of access to HEU for a couple of weeks while they were figuring out what was going on. And the person who reported's boss was like, what have you done? You've deprived the organization of these skills. We're going to be weeks behind on our work. Well, you can bet that guy's never going to report again. So a fourth lesson that we drew is don't assume that it's only going to be one insider. Conspiracies of insiders are possible, and yet a lot of security systems are designed to cope with only one insider, including a lot of nuclear security systems. In one study from Sandia National Labs, they looked at heists from heavily guarded non-nuclear facilities of millions of dollars or millions of dollars in valuables and so on, and found that it was more common to have more than one insider than it was to have only one insider in the set of heists they were looking at. So where it's practical, it's often expensive, but where it's practical, you ought to design the security system to have at least some capability against more than one insider working together. A fifth lesson is don't rely on only one layer of security. Some people say, oh, I've got portal monitors at the exit that will set off an alarm if somebody's taking out the highly enriched uranium or whatever it is you're protecting. Or I've got searches at the exit. Well, those can all be beaten. This is a picture of an amazing real-life theft from the Antwerp Diamond Center in 2003, which had just an unbelievable security system with many, many layers. But there was a team of thieves, it's really sort of a real-life Ocean's 11 kind of situation, that collected intelligence for over 2 years. They set up a real diamond trading firm so that they could have an office in the building and a safe deposit box in the vault, and we're going in and out of the vault and observing all of the security for years, and then finally ripped off millions of dollars from the vault. So you need to have a multi-layered system to protect against insiders, and you need realistic testing and red teaming to try to understand, if you're an intelligent adversary, is there a way you could figure out to overcome this system we've put in place? A sixth key lesson, and it sort of is, there's a miasma of it around all of the lessons, is don't assume that the culture of the organization doesn't matter, or that disgruntlement of employees doesn't matter. Culture of an organization, and whether it's really paying attention to security, not just the security force, but everybody in the organization, can be very, very important. This is not an insider case, but it is an amazing security culture case. This was the intrusion at Y12 in 2012, where an 82-year-old nun and a couple of other elderly protesters went through multiple layers of alarmed fences. And so they were setting off alarms in a line going directly toward the building with thousands of nuclear bombs worth of highly enriched uranium in it. Got right up to the HEU building. We're pounding on it with hammers, singing songs, painting on it with blood. There were very heavily armed guards inside that building who heard the pounding. And even though it was before dawn and they hadn't been told about any construction that was planned, they said, must be construction we didn't know about, and didn't bother to go check. Eventually they were accosted by a single guard. So why did the guards not respond to all these alarms? So it turns out the organization had recently installed a new intrusion detection system, and they had tried to cut corners on the cost of it by incorporating some elements of the old system into the new system, and that didn't work very well and caused 10 times as many false alarms as before to be set off. Well, normally you would use cameras to check out the false alarms, but the cameras in this area of the site had been broken for months, and no one had bothered to fix them. So then the idea was, well, we'll send out the guards when there's an alarm. But because there were so many false alarms, the guards had gotten sick of it. And so at that point, you may as well not bother to have an alarm system, because nobody's reacting to the alarms. So there was a major breakdown in the security culture at the site. A good example on this disgruntlement case is the Chelsea Manning case, who's also an issue of sort of emotional disturbance. She was dealing with her sort of dawning recognition of a transgender identity in the middle of the military that was still don't ask, don't tell at that time. But she was very bad at her job, similar to Nidal Hasan. She constantly showed up late. And there was a meeting where she was told, because of your constant lateness, we're taking away your 1 day a week off. And she got so angry, she flipped over the interview table and went for the gun rack in the room and had to be restrained. And 3 weeks later was when she started downloading. And in a study of cyber sabotage incidents, they found that they were almost always coming after some negative work event like that. A person is denied promotion, a person is reprimanded, a person doesn't get the job they thought that they deserved, and somebody else that they think is less worthy gets it, and then they commit these kinds of insider incidents. And over half of those people were already perceived by others in the organization as disgruntled before the incident occurred, but the organization didn't act on those things. The other thing that's interesting about disgruntlement is it's relatively easy for organizations to cope with. A lot of organizations have found that pretty simple steps, setting up a sort of employee complaint process where you can go talk to somebody and the person actually listens and validates your complaint and says, oh, I'm so sorry you're having that problem. And occasionally the organization actually deals with an employee complaint and changes something that employees are complaining about, can greatly reduce employee disgruntlement. And disgruntlement across a wide range of organizations, ranging all the way down to retail stores, is been identified as a major, major source of insider threat. When we did this talk in Washington, there's a storied CIA officer who's not yet fully come out who attended, and he said to me afterward, he said, "You're absolutely right on disgruntlement. Almost all the people I've ever recruited, they were willing to betray their organization because they felt their organization had betrayed them first." So, a seventh lesson. Don't forget that the insiders may know about the security system and what its weaknesses are. So, this is Robert Hanssen, one of the most devastating spies in U.S. history, and he was a counterintelligence officer. He was the guy who was supposed to be looking for spies. And he was able to monitor the search for the spy inside the organization that was looking for himself and modify his approaches and practices to avoid being caught by that investigation. Similarly, Edward Snowden. He was an NSA systems administrator. Part of his job was looking for the cyber weaknesses in the system so that they could be patched. We don't know whether the reason he had himself transferred to Hawaii was that he knew that in Hawaii they had not yet installed the network monitoring software to notice unusual user activity on the network. But it is true that he had himself transferred there and that they hadn't installed that software there. And so he was able to use very simple tools to download all the huge amount of material that he downloaded without detection. Another lesson is, you can make a lot of security rules, don't assume everybody's following them. People break security rules all the time. Any one of you who's been in a large organization with a lot of complicated security rules, I'm willing to wager has violated those security rules at some point. In my own case, for example, I'm always late on my trip reports when I do foreign travel. I just, don't get around to it. I got other things going on. I love this picture. It's a upgraded security door at a Russian nuclear facility, upgraded with U.S. assistance, and it's propped open. And what's amazing is it's propped open on the day the American investigators were there to take a photograph of it being propped open, which indicates they really didn't get the concept that it was a problem for it to be propped open. But this kind of thing comes up again and again and again and again. The real practice day to day is different from what's in the rule book. So this, I hate to gang up too much on my colleagues at Y12, but this is another example of not assuming the rules are followed. They had allegedly realistic testing of the security system, and the tests were important for the Guard Force because it affected the size of the bonus payment for the Guard Force contractor. And so there was a strong incentive to do well on the tests, and they managed to make connections with some of the people doing the testing and get warned ahead of time of exactly when and where and how the adversaries were going to attack, which made it much easier to defend. There are also reports that I think have never fully been confirmed that they were tampering with their laser tag equipment, essentially putting the batteries in upside down so that the being hit with a laser would not be detected, and so the defenders were basically unkillable in the exercises. A ninth lesson, don't assume that only the consciously malicious insiders matter. Inadvertent insiders can also be quite important. So this is the jailbreak in New York prison a couple of years ago. It had never had an escape before, I believe. And there was a conscious insider, but there was also an inadvertent insider who thought he was sort of exchanging things with the inmates to get information about other inmates for better situational awareness within the prison. And he'd given them a couple things he thought were innocuous. A couple of small tools, access to this catwalk that they eventually escaped through, and a bunch of hamburger from the conscious insider, and it was a lot of hamburger, and it had hacksaws inside the hamburger. And inadvertence is a big problem on the cyber front. We all know about, clicking on attachments and things of that kind, but these days the phishing efforts are getting very much more targeted and personalized, and so harder to recognize as phishing, especially in the age of social media when it's very easy to find out lots of personal things about you in order to target it. And finally, don't rely only on prevention and assume mitigation doesn't matter. This is not a security incident, it's a safety incident. This is a photograph of the destroyed reactor at Fukushima. But clearly, if you'd had some more attention to mitigation, even if you hadn't had the higher seawall for prevention, if you'd had the ability, for example, to get electricity restored, to get water pumped into the cores, you would have been able to avoid having so large a radioactive release. And similarly, if you think of the Chelsea Manning case, for example, why on earth was a private having access to all the secret cables from all the diplomatic posts all over the world? There's no need for that person's job. If Chelsea Manning had only had access to what she needed for her job, there would have been much less damage done. We have an amazing chapter by Heckhammer and Daly that provides a lot of interesting data on what jihadists have actually done about nuclear facilities, and also what they've written about, not only in sort of publications, but in even looking into the dark web and so on. And they find actually that there's not a lot there, that jihadis very rarely talk about nuclear issues in general and almost never talk about nuclear insiders. But we want to have a caveat to the caveat. First of all, almost all of the real thefts of potential nuclear bomb material, the real sabotages of nuclear facilities, which, by the way, happen more often than people realize, have been perpetrated by insiders or with the help of an insider. Number one. Number two, jihadists often use insiders in other contexts. So this attack in Afghanistan that killed over 100 Afghan troops just the other day, there were allegedly 4 insiders at the base cooperating with the outside attackers, and there are many other cases. So I think I'm going to, in the interest of time, skip our sort of positive, what should people be doing, and we can get to that in Q&A if people are interested. But let's.
Okay, why don't you get to the last slide though, there. Okay, one last comment before Q&A is that we welcome both questions and comments on our book, but especially welcome stories, your own experiences of best practices and worst practices. We have already been collecting a set from other talks that we have given of chapters that we wished we had commissioned and that we may someday commission for others. Sig Hecker has told us about his view of the Wen-Ho Lee case, the spy in Los Alamos, that he, as the director, had been told about for over a year before the man was arrested, and was told that he could not stop Wen-Ho Lee from getting classified information. He had to do nothing to make Wen-Ho Lee suspect that he was under investigation, because then he might stop stealing things. And if he stops stealing things, stealing classified information and taking it home, we might not find out what he's doing with it. We've heard from Rolf Moet Larsen about the big difficulties of intelligence in the nuclear area when he moves over from CIA to Department of Energy, and they have very different cultural views about how to treat insiders and how to treat loyalty. We've heard from Paul Stockton, our former senior research scholar here, then Assistant Secretary of Defense for Homeland Security, about how he believes that it is very common when you have insider or outsider threats to increase the amount of classified material about them, about all our problems, to say, oh, that's the best way to prevent leakage, which means you have to have more people with clearances to do the work, which means the people who give clearances have a disincentive to do them well. It means you have more potential insiders because you add more and more people to the process. Paul's estimate is that there are 2 million people in the United States now who have secret clearances. That's a real problem. We add redundancy, we add safety and security, and it can sometimes backfire on us. We very much look forward to questions, comments? We'll follow the CSAC tradition of having a one-finger rule. Raise your hand if you want to get on the queue, and then a two-finger if you have something very specific that you want to follow up on the previous comment or question. Right here. Oh, and could we ask everyone to introduce themselves very briefly, their affiliation, and before you ask your question, comment, please.
My name is Harem Muri and I'm a member of community.
We welcome you here.
Thank you. And I know that you looked into the FBI and military, but I feel that the question is much deeper. And I want to go into Encino Hall as a weakness in Encino Hall and in the academic world, because I think that the academic world should lead the society, and I see that American society has a weakness, and we are short in that. We are not leading really the society. And this that I see in Encino Hall very clear. When we are not allowed to exercise any critique toward Islam, then I am wondering how we can apply this situation in military, in FBI, any place else. I see that academic world is silencing down anyone that comes with any critique toward Islam, and it's just like praising any woman come with the hijab. All the academic, I'm just criticizing everyone here. Just treat the woman with the hijab like a holy cow and bowing and all, and don't see that these people are suppressing millions of women and millions of people are against the human rights, against them.
So is there a question?
My question is that shouldn't we start to criticize ourselves in the academic world, what we are doing, how we are leading the society and the rest? Because I'm worried about the military that come and learn here to just respect Islam, and what we are respecting. Are we respecting fascism? Why we are respecting Islam? What is that we are respecting?
It sounds like the political correctness, the issue that
Is deeper than political
Right.
correctness.
So let me bring it back to the case. So this is one of the fault lines of discussion in the case, which is how you label a problem can send you in a different direction than somewhere else. So there's a big debate among not only academics but policymakers about should you label this attack a terrorist attack because it's, by the way, on a military facility. Is it a matter of workplace violence, which is what many in the Obama administration wanted to call it? Is it about violent extremism, which doesn't use the phrase Islamist in it? Or is it something more specific? I would say, I'm obviously a biased participant here, being an academic, that there is a free-flowing dialogue in the academy about these issues, and it's to the good. And we have colleagues across the campus that take a variety of different perspectives. And that civil discourse is the heart of what we do. So I think, yes, there is this discussion in the policymaker environment. There's a big debate about the efficacy of one approach or another. But there's a pretty free-flowing discussion in the academy, particularly here at Stanford. I also want to emphasize that the takeaway that I got from spending several years on this event, and by the way, I started by assisting the Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee on its investigation of Fort Hood. The FBI then reclassified parts of that report before I was going to testify about it in open hearing so that they could protect themselves from embarrassment about their own mistakes. And eventually, by the time Scott and Matt asked me to write about it, all of this had been declassified. So I've been waiting for a long time to write about this. The investigation of Fort Hood, I think, was a very important investigation by the Senate, by the FBI, and an effort to try to distill lessons learned. And I think the real takeaway from that, I hope the real takeaway from that, is how insignificant the political correctness argument is in understanding why Nidal Hasan was not captured in time. All of these other factors, the fact that he was put into a promotion system that left no room for putting down a red flag. The fact that the system of joint terrorism task forces, by design, ended up having people with the wrong kind of expertise to investigate him successfully. The fact that FBI joint terrorism task forces who want to do the right thing and catch an insider threat could not, despite the best efforts of special agents and analysts, work together to actually coordinate the collection of intelligence. Those factors are the primary factors that led us not to catch Hassan in time.
Anna Pacelli.
You mentioned a number of examples from the nuclear domain, and I was wondering if you managed to identify some organizational failures or some organizational practices with regard specifically to the U.S. Nuclear laboratories, similarly to what Amy was doing in the case of the FBI and the Army.
So we would argue that a lot of the organizational issues in the 10 lessons apply very broadly across lots of different kinds of organizations. We do not have a in-depth chapter in the book that's a U.S. nuclear laboratory case. As Scott mentioned, Wen-Ho Lee would make a good paper as a sort of an example of how the sort of not only the organizational issues within the lab, but more importantly, perhaps the clashes between the desire to protect against a potential threat and the desire to collect information to lead to a conviction, which can often point you in quite different directions. Similarly, in the case of the AQCon black market nuclear network, which is, arguably an amazing insider case, since AQCon was sort of a major leader of Pakistan's nuclear weapons program. U.S. intelligence, the U.S. policymakers wanted to act against the network much sooner, and U.S. intelligence agencies kept saying, but we're still getting more information, and if we act too soon, we may not be able to root it out completely. We may not know all of the branches. We should wait. And, that's a completely legitimate debate internally within the government. But I would argue in retrospect that a bunch of the most important damage the Con network did happened in the last few years when the U.S. government was already aware of the network's activities and watching them. So I would argue we would have been better off in the net had we acted sooner.
Herb.
Herb Lynn, CSAC, I do some cyber stuff here. You started off much of the conversation here with the idea of people doing intensive background checks and so on, and trying to assess individuals and the individual characteristics and so on. And yet, one of them regarding the reliability of an individual. And yet, one of the most robust results in psychology and assessment is that actuarial assessments are much, much better than clinical assessments in terms of the accuracy and so on. That is, you just take you essentially compile statistical information about them, forget about them as an individual, and just look at the statistics and make your judgment that way, rather than doing the individual case-by-case thing. And the reason that the psychologists seem to think that this is true, that the results are so much more accurate, is that when you get individual cases, there's always some rationalization for some anomalous factor, and then you just never. So I was wondering if you could comment on the applicability of that to this whole process of quote clearing people for insider access.
I don't have a good comment, Matt.
So
Amy?
it's actually a much broader result than just in the psychology literature. Basically, on almost any point, if you can take human judgment out of it and reduce it to numbers, you'll get a better prediction. It's actually, for those of us who spend all our time on making predictions, it's very depressing because, for example, if you want to predict the price of a Bordeaux wine 10 years in the future, do not let anybody taste it. Look at what is the usual price for that vineyard and what was the weather that year, and you will have a much better prediction. If you let people taste it, they think they know, and they excessively discount. If you want to predict the student's performance, do not interview them. Do not read their essay. Go only on the numbers. You will do much better. As soon as you read the essay, you think you know, and you discount the numbers more than you should. It's very depressing to me because I waste a lot of time reading admissions essays on the admissions committee. But not only waste a lot of time, but apparently do a lot of damage, the data suggests, by reading the essays. But I think it's very difficult to apply that kind of approach to either a clearance investigation or an ongoing monitoring, because in those cases you do need to know about the individual. If you're just doing sort of a statistical thing, you're going to exclude bunches of people. You'll have lots of false positives. It is a sort of person by person business when you're talking about giving people admission to. But I think it is an example that, because our human judgment is so poor, again, one of our, I think, lesson number 2 is don't put too much reliance on the background checks. Not only is our human judgment poor, but the people who do background checks in particular, I would argue, maybe have less than average judgment.
So, Herb, I take your point, which is an excellent one, but I'm also very wary of relying on non-human judgment for these kinds of decisions. Let me give you a couple examples why. If you just used a sort of large N decision-based algorithm about who should operate in the United States intelligence community, you would rule out people who were born abroad, who have extensive family connections, who have all sorts of relatives, experiences, who are, by the way, probably the most valuable people that you want inside the intelligence community. And we have a hard enough problem with the intelligence community as it is with security clearances, convincing the security folks that the risk-reward trade-off is actually something that needs human decision-making in order to make sure we have the most valuable people who understand the language, who understand the culture, who have a feel of what it's like to actually be in those societies, to work in the United States government. So I take your point, but I think there are some real drawbacks to having a broad, non-human approach to those choices as well.
No disagreement with that. The point is that preventing the insider threat thwarting the insider threat is not the only goal you have in life. And I mean, that's the point that you're making. Right about it. But
I wanted to give one more humorous example of both how following the book and a human judgment problem in security clearances can create problems. After 9/11, I gave my 5-year review for a clearance that I hold, and was brought under lights in an investigation because I had mentioned anything change in your history, your life, your family, etc. And I mentioned that my brother-in-law had been made the Surgeon General of Thailand. And there's a box that says if you have militaries in their family who are from foreign countries, you get investigation. I said, well, I was brought under lights to say, why had you not told us he was in the military? I said, because he's not, he's a doctor. And they said, he's the Surgeon General. And I said, yeah, he is, and he's sort of a general, but he's... but you can laugh, and I wanted to laugh, but I can't because I'm under lights with the person who has a lot of enormous power over me. So I had to just keep repeating this. And it was both a case of human judgment, hopefully, or at least I can judge by the result, that my story was believed by human judgments further up the chain who looked at that investigation. Chris Lawrence, you had a two-finger?
Yeah, Chris Lawrence, former CSEC fellow. I think one thing that you probably get from an actuarial assessment that seems to be missing here, and forgive me if I missed it in the book, but so you've looked at a bunch of individual cases, and then you say, okay, so what are the things that were visible beforehand that jump out at us, and those are the red flags. But in order to show that something's a red flag, you have to also demonstrate that it's absent in the cases where there wasn't a problem. Is there a way to approach that empirically or assess, if these things are present in the cases in a lot of negative cases, are they also absent? Because otherwise there's this sort of creep, right? We start talking about, oh, they had unrequited love, or like they were disgruntled. There's probably a lot of those cases.
So there's probably not a lot of cases that don't end up being a problem where people send emails to their employees speculating about ending up in the newspaper with a headline of "Mad Scientist in Control of Deadly Anthrax."
You'd want a mechanism for distinguishing between those.
So the reality is, at the level of really granular analysis that Amy, for example, does in her chapter, you can't do large N of those. And often when you get to the really granular analysis, you find that the answer is different than when you did the sort of very basic analysis. So Amy pointed out that, the Senate investigation said, oh, it was, individuals' problems, and she basically said, no, it's the organization. And in fact, if you look at Diane Vaughan's classic on the Challenger launch decision, it's exactly the same story. The initial investigations said, it was, bad managers breaking the rules. And she said, no, it was following exactly the procedures that had been established that led to the bad outcome. And so it's almost the opposite when you really went to the granular level. There are people who have done some large N stuff, mainly in the cyber world, and so you can actually look at statistics and see how much of this is present in average employees and how much of this is present in employees that committed some cyber act. But that's the only database I'm aware of that has enough cases to do that kind of analysis. If I could offer a criticism of our own book, I think we have too little of the, we focus mainly on the type of error of not seeing the insider, and I think not enough on the type of error of having false positives, of accusing people of being insiders when they're not, or tearing the organization up looking for insiders when they aren't there. We do discuss the case of James Jesus Angleton at the CIA, practically destroying the CIA's intelligence operation by thinking everybody's a mole,
David, you have a two-finger on this?
Yeah, because it really follows on from what Matt said. So I read the 10 worst practices, right? And each one makes a great deal of sense. But then I thought at the end, well, what kind of organization do you have? You don't trust anyone. You encourage people to write to the bosses about people they suspect. You don't trust clearances. So you have a lack of trust, and I wonder if you push those too far, are you not undermining the kind of organizational culture that you really need and want to have people, to avoid the insider threat. And Matt, you just mentioned that you do mention James Jesus, sorry. Angleton at the end of the book, but that's a little thing after you have laid out all these things not to do, and then you have a little heading saying avoid undue suspicion. And I thought, so obviously, at least the way I read it was, you have some anxiety or a little bit of concern about if you really followed your rules carefully, you would have a place that was just mired in suspicion and lack of trust.
So I actually don't agree with that. I think that it is possible to build a high-performance organization that is also aware of threats and is a high-vigilance organization. So that's the first sort of goal that we lay out here. And I do think it involves sort of a comprehensive approach. I think that if you have really strong leadership in an organization, it's better at making the organization do its mission well and is better at providing safety and security than weak and dysfunctional leadership. But it is an important issue. You need to build an organization that has enough internal cooperation and trust to get its job done. But I think in many cases, for example, on the reporting, you can make it a more routine thing and a thing that is integrated with employee assistance programs, so that part of the result of reporting odd behavior by somebody may be that a person who needs help gets the help that they need. If Bruce Ivins had gotten better treatment when he needed it, he'd still be alive, and so would several other people. I'll tell you an example that actually didn't come up when we were at Livermore, but it's from Livermore. One of the security guys at Livermore really wanted to be able to track where all the employees were within the facility in real time. And the unions were like, no, we don't want that. You know, you're spying on us, blah, 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 blah. And he came up with a brilliant idea, which was, he said, no, what we want to do is provide medical assistance. If you fall down and break your leg or have a heart attack or whatever, here's this button you can push on this thing you're going to wear on your belt, and we'll be able to come right away and help you. And they were like, great, fantastic. But the thing was telling him where everybody was all the time. And that was, you know, part of being able to help, was knowing where to go when the button, you know, was pushed. So I think there are different ways to do things within the organization that can help give you a sort of loyalty culture and still a vigilant culture.
Sig?
Not easy to do.
Is this two finger or one finger? Well,
Probably
since
both.
I've already mentioned you, I
Yeah.
think we'll make it a two
Probably both
finger.
would be my guess.
Okay, Sig Hecker from CSAC. I have the inverse problem of usual seminars where I say, I heard the talk, but I haven't read the paper yet. So in this case, I read the book, but I haven't heard the talk because I was teaching class.
We corrected all the mistakes in the book in the talk.
So two comments that I wanted to make, having read the book and also just at least hearing some of the discussion. So first, I guess you already mentioned the Wen-Ho Lee case. And what the Wen-Ho Lee case was, it's a case of essentially competing priorities. And I guess that's the way that you explained it. So here was in February of 1986, the FBI, as newly minted director of Los Alamos National Laboratory, had the FBI come and see me and they say, you have an inside spy in your theoretical design division. And I said, get rid of him. Because it's the FBI's job to do that. So 12 years later, when I left the directorship, the guy was still there because I wanted to get rid of him so he stopped stealing our secrets, and the FBI wanted to convict the guy. And a 12-year saga that was absolutely incredible of what we went through, and I couldn't get the guy out the door, and he was stealing us blind, and in the end, his biggest danger to Los Alamos and his biggest impact was what David Holloway just brought up. The loss of trust in the organization. The loss of trust. In the end, you have to depend. You know, when I can go out with secrets, not just by taking a flash drive or a book, I have secrets in my head. There's a certain amount of trust you have to have, and it didn't work in that case because of competing priorities. And there are competing priorities all the way down the line. For example, you know, as director of the plutonium facility, you had security and you had safety. So if you have a problem from a safety standpoint, first thing you do is you head out the door. In security, you lock the doors. And this is very common here as well. You have competing priorities. And then the second issue of what I thought would have really helped the book is what I call an insider's view of your insider's threat. In other words, get somebody from one of these places, you know, like when I was at Los Alamos. And for example, my evolution of seeing that threat from a student to a staff member to a manager to a director, I went through all of these different things. We had competing priorities, and I had to worry not, as you write, for example, if a company says, or the organization says, that we put production over the security. I was there as a staff member. I said, I'm not going to lock up that plutonium tonight, because if I lock it up and put it in the vault, it's going to take me an extra half hour tomorrow to take it out. Not because of production, but I had research that I wanted to. And so you have to look at it from the inside. We do a risk-based analysis. What risk do I think I'm going to take by not locking up the plutonium? And nobody's going to get inside of this facility to do so. You go through this all of the time. And so it's not this rigid aspect, you know, do we do production? Because the company says, every person that's there makes this risk-based judgment. And so in the end, you do have to have trust, and you do have to have a way that sort of the safety over the years, safety has been built in. If you're going to operate a place efficiently, you have to have safety. I don't think we figured out how to include security into the operations rather than have it be separate. Where there's one organization that takes care of security, all the staff members, all the people have to have security as part of that. So sort of a regulatory engineering of security is what we need. So it'd be interesting, have somebody from the inside write about the inside.
I think it'd be a great follow-on project.
I think it should be Sig Hecker.
Amy started her comments when you weren't here, Sig, by saying that we had very gently roped her into this project by saying, why don't you give a comment? Well, why don't you write up that comment, etc. So beware. We'll be in touch. Dave Bernstein.
I'm a former insider. In the Fort Hood case, suppose they had seen the red flags, taken the necessary action to protect the Army base or whatever they do. Is there a willingness and an infrastructure for preventing this person from killing just as many people in the grocery store?
Well, you put your finger on the ultimate challenge in counterterrorism, which is there's always a softer target, right? So after 9/11, where you have hardening of military installations and government facilities, there's an increase in terrorist attacks on softer targets like hotels or the Boston Marathon or other areas. So you can't prevent it.
If you had stopped that single person.
You could have stopped that person from committing the attack that he did. You could have gotten him out of the military where he didn't have access to the kind of firearms that he used in the attack. But could I say that had he been disciplined or dismissed from the military or potentially arrested for other offenses, would he have never committed a terrorist attack? No, I don't know whether that would be the case.
Joseph.
So I had a similar reaction. I'm Joseph Jurigan, I'm a postdoc here. I had a similar reaction to David. Maybe it's because we both study the Soviet Union. But, when you create these mechanisms to deal with these insider threats, you see the same problem of why you have the insider threats in the first place, which is these personal issues becoming really prominent. So people learn the system and they game the system, and then they use that system to hurt people that they don't like for personal reasons. And then when you do create this climate of suspicion, very often individuals will lose faith in the organization's mission, and they'll form smaller groups because they don't trust the machine that just eats people up as soon as it gets a little blip that a certain person might be a problem. So I believe that you can find a happy medium, but it would be interesting to sort of conceptualize where exactly that is.
So I think that's absolutely right. You can have an organization that is so distrustful that it creates disgruntlement that increases the insider threat rather than coping with the insider threat. And one of the points we make on our list of sort of things organizations should do is you need to have, of course, to have some kind of investigations process when you do get some reporting on somebody. But that investigations process has to be seen by the employees as fair and reasonable. Because if you're just chopping people's heads off the moment you get the slightest indication of a problem, nobody will report anymore. And so you need to have this balance between being vigilant but also being aware of the fact that a lot of reports turn out to be false positives. And the need to build the sort of esprit de corps of the organization and maintain it. So it's a tricky thing.
I'm going to call on Alan Weiner, not only because he raised two fingers, but because I felt so sorry for him sitting on the floor because he came late. Alan, introduce yourself and then...
I'm Alan Weiner from the law school, and I spent 11 years in government where the issue that I was kind of focused on probably the most was the protection of classified information, not materials. But I will say I listened to the talk, and there's a part of me that just feels an enormous shudder going up my spine as somebody who lived with what were a number of preposterous security regimes and measures which served almost no function whatsoever. And the thing, and so I'm piling on the idea of trust, and the thing that leapt out for me, Scott, is this, the suggestion that there are 2 million people with clearances. And how many of them, right, are engaging the kind of behavior that we're really kind of concerned about here?
Very, very few of them.
Right, so I'm wondering
There's too much classified information. That's why we have too many people with
But in
clearances.
general, there are lots of people with access to nuclear materials, there are lots of people with access to weapons, right? And I'm wondering if there's a problem here of sorting on the dependent variable, right? And the systems maybe are actually doing a pretty good job as they are, and you just have to recognize that any population this large, there's a certain amount of incidence of risk, and do we cause more harm, right, with trying to bureaucratize and institutionalize a whole series of additional security measures and trying to change culture in a way which I know how that's going to impact, how that's going to land on the ground. It's going to slow people down. It's going to make it hard for people to do their job. It's going to make organizations lower performing. And so I just wonder, do you also look at organizations that, or is there maybe work to be done on organizations that actually do a pretty good job, right, of managing these risks as opposed to only looking at failures?
So I definitely think there's a follow-on project to be done on organizations that seem to have gotten it reasonably well. There are organizations that, for example, have reporting systems that seem to work pretty well. And they get a fair amount of reporting and they look into things, and people are taken off access for a week or two and then they come back on access, and it's just a normal part of life, and it's not considered, a terrible thing and so on. But I think here, I don't think we are pushing for a huge bureaucratized set of things. In fact, in another thing I've been writing, I have proposed, I've pointed out that a huge number of rules are stupid, and that I've proposed that every organization ought to have a process for employees to nominate the rules that are most annoying and need to be modified, and make specific proposals for eliminating or modifying some of the rules. But I think the lesson I do see in organizations that I talk to all the time, a lot of these issues and the 10 issues that we outlined coming up again and again, and really weakening the vigilance against insider threats in a bad way. I mean, just on the not in my organization, for example, the IEE wanted to do guidance on how organizations can prevent insider threats in nuclear organizations. And for a while, the Argentinian government was objecting on the grounds that there's no such thing as an insider, and so there's no need for this guidance. And this delayed the guidance for over a year, I think. This idiotic view that it was impossible to have a nuclear insider. But there are still people who feel that way.
So Alan, I take your point. You're absolutely right. But I think the premise of your comment is that the probability of an insider is low. And I think that the difference is the probability of an insider causing damage may still be low, but the magnitude is going up exponentially, right? So you talked about Hanssen. So Hanssen stole a few thousand documents over 20 years, put them in garbage bags in a dead drop in a Virginia park, right? Chelsea Manning stole 250,000 documents on a fake Lady Gaga CD, right? Edward Snowden stole an estimated 1.5 million documents within less than a year. So the probability of a malicious insider doing something may still be very low, but the damage of that insider now is going way up because of our digital world.
I have time for one last question. The first person...
And we should mention there are books for sale outside.
I'm going to ask Farzan, who has been very patient, with deep apologies to many other people. So
this kind of picks up on the last point that
Can you speak up so people in the back
Farzan Sabet, Stanton Nuclear Security Fellow here at CSAC Stanford. So I want to pick up on something, the last comment that Amy made about the kind of changing magnitude of the danger. Having looked at all these cases which are kind of taking place during our transition from kind of a pre-digital to a digital workforce, and having this kind of bird's eye view of the cases, and having spoken with others like in the process of researching the book, how do you see the kind of both threat and then solutions toward addressing insider threats kind of having qualitatively changed in this transition period? And what's kind of the difference moving forward?
You want
start
sure,
on that, Amy?
sure. So I'd say, to your point, Matt, that it's the inadvertent insider that's becoming a much more serious threat, right? We all get these phishing emails and it's getting more and more sophisticated. So, you can reduce the probability of an inadvertent insider clicking on the wrong email and exposing the entire network, but you can't reduce it to 0. You probably can't even reduce it to 5%. So that's a non-trivial percentage, and it's getting worse because, of course, it's a dynamic threat environment. And cyber actors are figuring out whether it's man-in-the-cloud attacks or malware on your phone or the WannaCry ransomware over the weekend. They're adapting to the threat landscape. So I think it's that inadvertent insider that is growing. But there are some pretty innovative ways to deal with the inadvertent insider threat. And you look here in the Valley at some of the leading tech companies, the gamification of security. In contrast to a sort of malevolent insider, you can have a joint responsibility where everyone's in this together, where you're not penalized for coming forward saying, I clicked on the wrong email. And so Facebook, when Joe Sullivan was the Chief Information Security Officer, really pioneered this approach. So there is a silver lining, David, to the otherwise dark cloud of having increased vigilance in an organization for the inadvertent insiders.
I think there's a couple of other aspects that are changing. One is just people very rarely now are going to be in jobs for 30, 40 years at a time. There's going to be more turnover, less probably intensive loyalty to the organization because you're going to be there for a couple of years, then you'll go on and off and do something else. Secondly, in this world of social media, if you want to recruit somebody, it's very easy to know who are the people who work in particular positions at a facility I'm interested in. What are they posting about on Facebook or Instagram or whatever? And so the sort of process of getting the initial information to make your approach or to find somebody to blackmail or whatever is very much facilitated by the world of social media. And that's just a reality. We have to live with it and figure out how to deal with it.
It is 5 o'clock. The bad news is that I wasn't able to call on Francisco, Tom, Larry, Anna, Len, Dave, and probably others who got on the queue too late. The good news is that we have wine and cheese about to be served and consumed, and everyone is welcome to help celebrate this. And I just wanted to add on a personal note, it is great to have this book session in the same room where the book was initiated and created. And especially wonderful, many of us here remember George Bunn, Matt's late father, and we have the tradition of having the book cover put on the wall next to George's old office. His book cover is there, and now Matt's edited book cover is facing George's in the hallway. So please join us in thanking my co-authors and editors, and join us for wine and cheese.